Hello, welcome to Hidden Revealed. This is a day-long event of conversations that are happening through the day in which disabled artists are going to be discussing their work and presenting some of their work to you. My name's Fiona Slater and I'm the Equality and Diversity Manager at the British Museum, and I'm going to give you a very brief introduction of the event. Just to give you a bit of a description about myself, I'm a 30-something-year-old woman in a floral, bright floral dress, and I've got shoulder-length curly brown hair. And just to give you a bit of background to the event and give you some housekeeping before I hand over to Jane Draycott, Dr Jane Draycott and Ellen Renton. These the artists that are going to be talking to you throughout the day have been sort of brought together and selected because we feel that they've got interesting things to say, connections to make with the British Museum collection and the exhibitions programme. So we're really interested in looking at this across the museum, and there's some research projects that are happening behind the scenes to help us to kind of unpack this a bit further, and it's something we'll be doing over the coming months and years. So currently we have a collaborative doctoral partnership with the University of Leicester, and that is Isabel Lawrence is looking at disability history and disability narratives and the collection. So it's something, as I said, we're really keen to develop further. And with, you know, over around 8 million objects in the collection, it does present a really unique resource to be able to explore disability history and narratives. So just some quick housekeeping. There is some captioning available, so that's through stage text with My Clear Text. So if you click on the CC button at the bottom of your screen, you should be getting some live captioning. We've turned off the chat function, so you won't be able to chat through the session, and that just makes it more accessible for people who are accessing with screen readers. What else to say? There's a Q&A button, so at the bottom of the screen you should have a Q&A button. And if you have questions for the panel throughout the event, then just put your questions in there, and we'll have time at the end. We'll have about 15 minutes at the end to go through that. I think those are the main things that I wanted to talk to you about. Yeah, so I'll pop back at the end, but I'm going to hand over to Ellen Renton and Dr Jane Draycott. Ellen is a artist, a writer and poet based in Scotland. And Jane is an academic and lecturer at the University of Glasgow, who will be in conversation together. And I'm going to hand over to them now, and I'm going to disappear. So I hope you enjoy the event.
Going to start with some poems, if that's okay, Jane?
That's absolutely fine.
So this is what Athena saw when Tiresias looked. Part 1, Athena. She wanted guilt for once. She had forged apologies for the audacity of a bare ankle and the carve of her hips, for the pure cheek of her height and breadth. But she'd never tried deliberate crime. A long week lent the water its tint. Was bathing brazen? He watched her like she was his inheritance. And when she stole the colour from his eyes, she nearly smiled. The boys would still sit chatting sin. She couldn't buy the confidence of a saunter in darkness, but she could stop him. He begged her bring the colours back, but she tested guilt in her hands and liked its weight. A sore and honest thing. Tiresias. He learned how to live without edges. No clue where he ended and the sky began. He used to shout over sounds that now gave an outline when his memory sketched the look of the last time. An eye for an eye for an eye. His guilt was the sort to change its mind, chalk clouds in his thoughts then slink off, but he knew that day he leapt over the line between taking and stealing a look. Now he measured the ground ahead in decades, and with his other sight, he watched the blind shred his name like paper, as the future built an empire on the back of his tail, sold the sightless like a gift shop wonder, as their voices were demanded to sail when others couldn't make their words tread water, as shame and magic were written into them forever.
Well, thank you, Ellen. Those were lovely. I'd like to know what inspired you to write them?
I was quite keen to work with myth in some way. I'm really interested in stories and the origins of stories and how we continue to retell the same stories in different ways. And I think myths are quite a sort of source to return to when you're thinking about writing in that way. And I'm particularly interested as a visually impaired person in myths surrounding sight and how they've maybe shaped how sight is perceived now, or perhaps how we retrospectively look at sight now in reference to ancient myth. And when I came across this particular myth, I like the fact that with myth you sort of get the spine of it. You know, like I found this very basic kind of simple plot, and there's so many things you can fill in around it or sort of move to different eras or different times. And when I read this, I really imagined this contemporary setting around it, and could relate to things in both characters' stories. With Athena, the idea of privacy defiled, that sort of sacred moment of privacy and vulnerability being abused by somebody else. And that kind of fury within her. I pictured her as a sort of like late teens kind of girl, that feeling where you've got this new body and people treat you differently because of it. So I related to that part in her story. And with Tiresias, obviously the visual impairment aspect, but also the fact that how maybe the idea of his second sight that Athena gives him, the fact that that's maybe, I'm interested in the fact that I think blind people are often assumed to have some kind of other gift as a sort of compensation. And I think that's still quite widely believed, that you must have some kind of other magical properties. And I was interested in considering if Tiresias was sort of the source of that belief. And I like the idea of Tiresias being able to see the future and being able to see the consequences of his actions stretched down for thousands of years, just from this one moment with Athena.
Yes, I thought it's interesting that you start the pair with Athena. You tell her story first, and then you tell Tiresias's. So he's almost the supporting character in her life, in her drama, but then he obviously has a drama of his own as well.
And I suppose her story is about a second. You know, it's about one tiny moment, whereas his is about a kind of, you know, an endless lifetime, I suppose, because he can see that far.
Boy, it's yes. I mean, he seems to. There are various different versions of the myth, because there isn't one version of any Greek myth. There are lots of different versions depending on who's telling them or where they're being told. And so there's Tiresias. Actually, there's a lot of variety in his story, and in some of the stories, he's given the ability to hear the language of birds as compensation for his loss of sight. In others, he is given the gift of prophecy. In others, he has a very long life. In others, he retains his sentience in the underworld, which other people don't. So he does seem, there seem to be all sorts of different directions that you can take this idea of this, the long-term ramifications of his act and Athena's punishment for it.
It's interesting to think of them all as, I suppose, as synonyms for second sight, I suppose.
Yes, I mean, I suppose that they're all sort of connected in a way that they make him, they set him apart from other people, or they make him something extraordinary, and he pops up as a significant player in other people's myths, other people's stories as well. He has a role to play. So yes, and well, there are all sorts of other interesting things that he does, but I won't go into those because that would get us away from our main topic. So did you look at other Greek myths that involve sight or loss of sight? Because Tiresias is by no means the only person that kind of experiences this particular sort of set of events, or a version of this set of events.
Yeah, I did go down a sort of hole once I started, you know, there's quite a lot of, you know, interesting writing as well on disability within the myths. That one grabbed me because of both characters, I suppose. But it is, very interesting to me, this idea of sight being taken away so quickly. That does seem to crop up quite a lot, and almost like it's a sort of like a slap on the wrist equivalent sort of thing, or a fine or something like that. It's just a kind of, you've done that, therefore this will happen. It's quite like undramatic, the way it's written about almost.
Yes, I mean, I suppose there's a similar episode with a mythological figure called Actaeon, who accidentally sees the goddess Artemis bathing, and she responds rather more extremely than Athena does, because she has him torn apart by his own dogs. So in some respects, Tiresias, he gets off lightly. He does get punished, but he also gets compensated in many ways. I think
that would have made for a slightly different poem, I feel like.
Yes. And a much more gory film as well. Because the film that accompanies your poems is available for people to watch, and is very interesting as well. So I suppose then, I guess I would ask you now if we can talk a little bit more about this idea of the sudden loss of sight, because there's lots of ancient literary evidence for people having eye problems, losing their sight later in life through trauma, injury in battle, but also through illness or disease, eye infections, the aging process. And I think possibly what we see in the myths, this idea of this very sudden loss of sight, that's something that's relatively unusual for ancient people. They would lose their sight. If they had a trauma, they would lose their sight very suddenly, but they'd know exactly why. They'd been hit on the head or had an injury to their eye or whatever. With an illness or the aging process, it would happen quite gradually. But congenital sight loss seems to have been unusual in antiquity, just as it is today. And sudden unexplained sight loss also seems to have been quite unusual. So perhaps when we think about the loss of sight in mythology, we can think about it in those terms in relation to the experiences, the lived experiences of visually impaired people in antiquity.
Mm-hmm. And as you say, if there were if visual impairment was really quite prominent, then many more people experienced it. It would have those stories would have a different resonance as they do now.
Yes.
Especially, as you say, if it was for many people a kind of gradual process. Losing your sight instantly might not have the ramifications it would now.
Yes, I mean, there is this, I suppose we can think about how ancient people listening to those myths, hearing poets recite them or sing about them, how they might have understood them in relation to their own experiences of sight loss. Because of course we can read myths with a very sort of skeptical modern eye of them basically just being stories, but in antiquity they were potentially taken a lot more seriously by a lot more people.
And yeah, I suppose in that sense, the instant removal of sight, it's almost like bringing a process forward for people as a kind of punishment rather than inflicting something on them. You know, if visual impairment was so prolific and it was inevitable for most people, you would lose your sight eventually, then the depth or the scale of doing that would have a different effect on the reader, as you say, the listener.
Yes, I mean, one of the other aspects in the myth and in your poems as well is this sort of this idea of reciprocity. And in ancient Greek religion, we see a lot of reciprocity, that you need something from a god, you go to their temple and you make an offering. And we've actually got some images of some votive offerings in the British Museum's collection that people can see if they can, they can be brought up. So here we've got some votive offerings that were made to the god Zeus, and this is a plaque made of marble. It's got a pair of eyes, and it's got the text explaining the offering. And we have another one as well. So this is similar. This is a plaque. This time it's one eye, and these sorts of things, these sorts of offerings were made to gods, either in an attempt to get them to do something for you or to thank them for having done something for you. So there's very much a sort of quid pro quo going on, and we see that in the myth, we see that in Ellen's poems, and we can see that in the archaeological record as well. So Ellen, I wonder if we could maybe think about this idea of we've looked at divine punishment, Tiresias being punished for his transgression, but perhaps we should have a think about divine cure as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have a poem if you would like.
Absolutely.
So this is about imagining what that experience might be like, to be cured, and it's called Cured. Granny's new hearing aids have retuned the earth. The wind starts inside her now. Grandad stacks the dishes jungle loud while she begs the telly watch its tone. In the dream where a doctor's hands become God's own and they fix me up good and proper, I worry about the angles in my thanks. Of course, I'm grateful. But how could I stomach the whole world at once? Have you ever seen a seagull bloat to spitfire overnight? It might be nice to fear a falling leaf instead of early death. But how could I live with such colossal raindrops? I appreciate your miracle and the new depth in a face, but I can't hack all these colours I've no name for. And how would there be time for all the subtitled films? And would I barter with my eyes to get them closed? Maybe if I were handed shapes instead of digging them up myself, I would need sleep as much as a novelty gift. With that, I was just, thinking about what the implications would be, I suppose, in my own life. People often assume that you're kind of waiting for your vision to be corrected in some way. When people learn that I'm visually impaired, quite often the first thing people will say is, oh, can you get laser eye surgery? Or can your glasses not correct it? And I was thinking about how completely stressful that would be if one day I woke up able to see everything, because I understand the world through my own vision, and it shapes everything. My language, there's things that I don't know exist, and there's things that I do know exist that other people don't know exist. So yeah, and it was based. The idea came after being with my granny, whose new hearing aids were too loud, and it was just too much going on. There was too many sounds all of a sudden.
I mean, that's something that we don't really get a sense of that in ancient literature that talks about physical impairment, because most of those texts are written not by the people themselves, they're written by other people about them. So they're written by ancient doctors who are thinking of it purely in a medical sense. And ancient doctors, they tended to avoid attempting to treat conditions that they thought were incurable, because your reputation as a doctor really relied on you being able to cure people, and it was your reputation that got you new work, and you would be in competition with all of your peers. And so what we get in ancient medical literature is very much the this is what you should do in this situation, but that's the end of it. You never get a sense of, well, what happened to the patient once they recovered? How did they feel? Had their life changed? And when we do hear about people with impairments, we get a lot of references to visually impaired people in antiquity. We have them in mythology. So I mean, we have people like Tiresias. We have the Polyphemus, the Cyclopes, the Graeae, Lamia, and they're sort of mythological creatures. But we have people like Oedipus, who blinds himself because he can't bear to see the truth of what his life is and what he's done. And we get accounts of them using assistive technology like staffs to sort of help them walk and support them, and they use them as their eyes. They use them to feel things. Well, I suppose not as their eyes, but sort of as a compensation in a way.
Yeah.
And so that idea of making use of other objects and other people as well. I mean, that's the other thing we hear a lot about. Children supporting their parents, or enslaved people having to support their enslavers. So that's about as far as we get with information about what it would genuinely have been like to have been visually impaired in antiquity.
Do you think with the sort of social understanding of visual impairment have been the same, or the consequences of being visually impaired? Was it a visual society such?
Yes, I think on the one hand, the circumstances would have been quite variable, I think, depending on who you were and what your situation in society was and what was expected of you. Then the consequences could be relatively minor or fairly severe. So if you were a wealthy person, on the one hand, you had access to all sorts of assistance. We're dealing with people who, they don't tend to write their own letters. They have enslaved people who do that for them. They don't tend to dress themselves. They have people who do that for them. You know, so a lot of the day-to-day life stuff that you potentially have to relearn to do after you lose your sight, or you learn to do it in a different way, they wouldn't be doing that in the first place. So they wouldn't need to relearn that. They're not living independently, so they don't need to learn how to do it. But at the same time, it would mean that they were, to a degree, cut off from other people, in a society where you meet people face to face, and you look at them, and you face to face, and you have to sort of communicate with them, and a lot of emphasis is put on the actual physical act of seeing, and there are various different beliefs about eyes emitting things or eyes absorbing things. So that would be a factor. But I think whereas we privilege the visual quite a lot, in antiquity, speech and hearing were also incredibly important, because you needed to be able to communicate with other people. They needed to be able to understand you. You need to be able to understand them. And so speech impairments and hearing impairments, they were far more disabling than visual impairments in antiquity.
That's so interesting. Yeah, I was doing a few years ago a research project about visual impairment in poetry, and when visually impaired poets write, how their poems can feel different, because poetry is, sight is at the center of it, even in terms of talking about writing and images. There's kind of visual language is always used throughout. And something that I came across was this idea of ocular centrism, the idea of a Western idea, which privileges sight and places it at the top of this hierarchy of the senses, and how that isn't necessarily the case in all cultures, and how it sort of feeds into our language. So this particular research from the University of York, I think it was, and they were talking about how within the English language, we're really capable of discussing shapes and colours. We have so many words for that because our whole society is built around sight. And they did research with Indigenous cultures in Australia and New Zealand. And they were far more capable of describing tastes. They had far more language for taste and smell, because that's what their culture is built around. I think it's interesting to think about sight as not being, it doesn't mean the same everywhere, blindness, or the same thing throughout time.
Yes, I think the main issue in antiquity with losing your sight was the possibility that it made you vulnerable. So it's something that happens quite often to soldiers in combat, because they don't have eye protection. Their helmets don't afford them much protection of their faces, but particularly not their eyes, and because there are lots of ballistics and things like that. You read quite often about soldiers losing one eye or losing two eyes, and the enemy actually targeting soldiers' faces, targeting their eyes, because of this fear of this vulnerability. And that's, I think, when we read about the visually impaired in antiquity, and we read about the wealthy, they're not particularly vulnerable because they're protected and insulated by layers of other people. But it's quite common to find beggars being visually impaired, being described as being visually impaired, because I suppose that is the ultimate vulnerability. They have no protection. They are sleeping on the street. They have only their staff to guide them. They don't have anyone else who can render them assistance.
Interesting to consider that the sort of primary symptom is an emotion, or is an emotional state, is vulnerability rather than a medical concern.
Yes, I mean we do have plenty of medical treatments for them. We have another image actually of a stamp for an eye salve that we can show people. So yes, this is a small rectangular cuboid stamp with the name of the oculist and the salve, and the oculist would make up the salve, and then they would stamp it so that people who were wanting to buy a salve knew exactly which one they were getting and what it was intended to do. And we find these all over the place in the archaeological record of Britain and France, and we get a lot of documentary evidence in tablets and papyri and ostraca about people having eye infections. So we know that people did try very hard to protect their sight as far as they could. We find references to cataract removal operations, which in one sense were successful. The ancient oculist had a needle and could remove your cataract. It would just destroy the outermost layer of your eye in the process. So they didn't know that because they didn't have the same understanding of the eye that we do today. So people did work quite hard to avoid that possible vulnerability and that possible state of mind and state of living as well. So,
sorry, when you go.
I was going to say, we have time for another one of your poems.
Yeah, I was just thinking one slightly. Well, I can read it first. I think it's relevant to what you were just saying. The title of this poem is a real question I was asked after being on hold for a very, very long time. I'm sure some members of the audience might relate to that feeling. The question was, is it still a lifelong condition? As in, empty inbox. Every morning that isn't split by my shoes. As in, the most delicious hours are an underage contraband stash poured down the drain, and I hold my face like I didn't want a drink anyway. The usual dream in which I drive, only to slap myself awake when I crash in the motorway's burping gut. As in, sitting by the window for the body I was promised, waiting to be let down again like a girl in a song. A doubting Thomas with his knuckles deep in my roots, as if that's where I keep the answers. As in, that street I hushed just by walking down it. The lips of the whole top deck but hers, mate. Have you ever seen someone so ugly? As in, a wee life under engine threat. Feet forgetting their only job and hands clapping the silver bonnet. A tableau but for family screams. As I was going to say, I think that relates to what you were talking about in terms of often the sort of most affecting symptoms of a visual condition being the social aspects that surround it rather than the actual medical condition itself. And that's what that poem was about, actually, the fact that quite often other people's reactions or other people's treatment are the most disabling thing, rather than visual acuity itself.
Yeah, we see in ancient Greek mythology and in ancient society more broadly, particularly once we get into the sort of late antiquity with Christianity being prevalent, that there are things that are attached to the loss of sight. So in ancient Greek mythology, physical blindness can often sort of be a metaphor for sort of some other kind of blindness, moral blindness, blindness to the truth. And that sort of raises a flag, you know, why has this person lost their sight? What else is going on here? And what are we going to do about this? How do we respond to this? And we see in Christianity as well this idea of being struck blind because you have been metaphorically blinded about something, and then you regain your sight when you have been when you have changed your mind and changed your behavior, so you are no longer sort of morally metaphorically blind. And we also see this idea of punishment for sin. You know, what have you done that this has been inflicted on you? There must be some sort of other side to this. And so that's all very much about other people trying to process something that has happened to someone else, and not in the most empathetic or compassionate way, really, either. And I suppose that's something that we do have to bear in mind, looking at people in the past and trying to recover what we can of their stories and their experiences, is that we won't actually know. We can hazard a guess, but we won't know.
Yeah, and as well relates back to what we were talking about earlier about senses being prioritized differently. The idea of a culture, or, you know, I think to me that proves the existence of the social model of disability as opposed to the medical model. That a disability could be perceived in different cultures and at different times as having a varying degree of seriousness, or being socially limiting to a different degree. It proves the existence of that, you know, it's blindness has not been the same for all of time.
Yes.
Sorry.
Fiona.
There's no elegant way of inserting myself back into the conversation. It was fascinating, and it is, yeah, I don't want to interrupt, but we have got questions coming through. So I thought if I don't, you know, if we don't spend enough time sort of answering some of the questions, then I'm sure audiences will be very disappointed with me. But yeah, really fascinating talk, guys. So thank you for that. So I was going to ask the first question, but that seems very mean because we have got questions coming through. So I'm going to allow the audience to ask their questions, and then I'm going to save some up for myself at the end. So a few people have been asking about Homer. So there is some, yeah, a elusive character of Homer. Oh, and we've got an image of Homer's bust from the British Museum collection up on the screen now. So an interesting comment here about Homer was whether, it says, we know that Homer was probably more than one person, and he was depicted as blind, but do you think his blindness influenced some of the abstract quality of the verse in the Iliad and Odyssey? But then co-verse to that, there's also another question about Homer just saying, do we think that Homer was considered blind because it was a kind of PR branding? So it was more about the kudos and whether whether he was actually blind. So there's kind of a two-pronged thing to that. So I don't know whether, either of you can speak to that.
I would.
Ellen, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, regarding like the nature of his verse. I'm no expert, I'm no scholar when it comes to Homer, but generally speaking, as I mentioned earlier, there is Audre Lorde is a very good contemporary example of this. She was maybe not so famously known as visually impaired, but a very famous poet. And when you read her writing with that in mind, there's this like other texture to it. The poems sort of move. That she has this poem called Pirouette, and when you read it, you feel like you're spinning around. And I think it is because of this reliance on other senses. And she quite famously spoke about in her early years before her family realized she was visually impaired, before she had glasses, she thought there were white clouds and there were green clouds. And she thought that for all her early years. And then she got glasses and realized there were white clouds and there were trees. And I relate to that quite a lot in terms of sometimes you might look at something in her work and consider it to be really abstract. And actually, perhaps it's only abstract from a fully sighted person's perspective. You can kind of key into the abstract a bit more easily when the world looks a bit more abstract to you. So that's potentially something that you might find in Homer's work as well.
I mean, I guess I would come at this from a sort of classics, ancient history perspective. And I mean, we don't, as the first person with the question said, we accept that Homer was not a person. And when we attribute the poems to Homer, they're in actual fact, they were sort of gradually composed over a long period of time, incorporating lots of different myths. They are very visual, very descriptive poems. I mean, people have made various arguments about the Iliad and the Odyssey that because the battlefield injuries are so anatomically detailed that a doctor must have written them, and because there are so many women's activities depicted in the Odyssey, a woman must have written that. And I think that's, I guess I'll come into the sort of the second question about the marketing branding strategy. I mean, what we have in the Odyssey, we have the character of Demodocus, who is the visually impaired bard, and there's this idea that Homer, when it was still sort of thought that Homer was one single person, inserted himself into the poem as the bard character, and this is a sort of cheeky reference, but that is something that we see in all sorts of works of literature. This idea of the bard. Ellen and I talked at the start about the compensations that Tiresias was given, and this idea that bards are visually impaired, yet they are brilliant bards, because they can hear so much better and sing so much better, and they've sort of got this divine quality to them. So that is very much about branding and marketing. I mean, there is another poet, Stesichorus, from a bit later, and part of his branding was that he wrote a poem criticizing Helen of Troy and was blinded, and then once he wrote a poem praising her, his sight was restored. So yes, I think it's very much a branding comment on the power of poetry and the skill of particular poets.
Great, thank you. There's another question here which says a statement which says love the poems, Ellen, so that's capitalized. And it says, did you discover any real people rather than mythological people with disabilities in antiquity when you were researching?
Personally, I didn't look into that too much, but through Jane, I've now gained much more of an understanding of that. As Jane says, I suppose the narrative wouldn't have sat in the hands of those people themselves. And that quite often makes research about real people difficult, because when other people tend to write on behalf of visually impaired people or disabled people, quite often the writing tends to be a bit problematic or uncomfortable, and not necessarily a true reflection of that individual's experience. But yeah, through Jane, I've learned quite a lot more about it than I knew previously.
Yeah, I mean that it's a common assumption that because life was so hard in antiquity and life expectancy was so low, that people with disabilities couldn't possibly have survived in harsh historical conditions. But that's just simply not true. They are everywhere. They are referred to throughout literature. They are referred to in other types of evidence, documentary evidence, inscriptions and letters. They're in the archaeological record, in art, and in the remains of their assistive technology. So yes, I mean you can't really move without tripping over someone with a disability in antiquity, and they do deserve a lot more attention. It's one of the things that I try and do in my research, and other academics working on impairment and disability in antiquity do as well. We try and bring these forgotten, marginalized people forward and say, look, it's not just about emperors and kings and generals and that sort of person. And in fact, quite often the emperors and kings and generals were themselves impaired because they were injured in battle, or they had other challenges. So that's just Julius Caesar, for example, was epileptic.
Yeah, it's like this kind of common belief that you hear a lot, that sort of, I don't know, when there's used a lot around race as well, films set in the past or things, and we couldn't possibly have a disabled character because like they didn't exist. There's this kind of belief that it's a contemporary idea, when really it was just that fewer people had a voice to talk about it in those times, I suppose.
And in a lot of ancient literature, people don't talk about the boring day-to-day stuff that was everywhere. There are all sorts of things that we never hear about, but we know that people did those things because it's day-to-day life, and you do those things. So they're so prevalent that they don't need to be talked about quite often because they're not exceptional. I mean, they're talked about in some cases because they are exceptional. But otherwise, they're everywhere, they're there.
Yeah, the myths aren't sort of realist or like kitchen sink drama, I suppose. Like, not the kind of writing that was preferred then. That's quite a contemporary idea in itself.
We've got lots of knowledgeable audience members. So somebody actually sharing a link to an article called "The Staff of Oedipus: Transforming Disability in Ancient Greece," which is by Martha L. Rose, and they're saying that there's lots of writing on this and about the fact that disabled people existed.
It's basically since about 1995, academics in classics and ancient history started paying attention to impairment and disability in antiquity in a sort of systematic way. So you can still kind of count the number of books on the subject, probably on the fingers of maybe two hands now. So it's there are quite a few more articles, but it's a manageable amount of scholarship. If people are interested in this topic, you can absolutely get your head around it. Unlike Homer, whereas that's got sort of 2,500 years of people writing about Homer. But impairment, disability, and antiquity, a lot of work has come out only in the last couple of years, so it's very up to date, and it's being updated all the time because we find different approaches, different models becoming more or less useful as time goes on. And we have different questions that we ask as well. That's the other thing.
The person that shared the link is saying that they're a blind historian and kind of agree that it's totally changed over the past 10 years. It's a really exciting time. I wanted to, this is the bit where I insert my question, because I wanted to talk a little bit about, we mentioned the film that accompanies these poems, and there was a link sent in the email reminder to people that are registered for this event. People will also get a link to that tomorrow when they get a follow-up email. So if you haven't had that, then there'll be another link, and there's a short kind of introductory text to give a bit of a visual description in that email that's coming, to give a bit of a description about the kind of visual elements in that film. But I wanted Ellen to ask you to kind of explain a little bit more about the film and the kind of process of putting that together and translating your poems that you read beautifully for us at the beginning of the event into a film. Give people a bit more info on that.
Of course, yeah. These poems were actually always intended for film. They was as part of a Unlimited, who are a disability arts program who funds disabled artists to make work. They began a new program of micro commissions during lockdown the first one, to support disabled artists to make work during that time. And I was very keen to try and continue with collaborative work. I really enjoy working across art forms and working with other people. And obviously that became much harder when everyone was at home by themselves, but I was keen to work on a way that could still happen. And film is one of the most obvious ways of doing that, because it incorporates so many different skills, and this film in particular brings together a lot of different forms. And so the film, I worked with a director, a musician, and we also had 2 dancers involved as well. So it was very interesting because the translation process was manyfold. It kept happening and happening. So the music, the director had the idea for the film about bringing all these things together. And it is like translation. So then translating it, we then worked with the musician. And that's always fascinating to me. I've worked with musicians before, but to hear the mood that they bring out of the poem, because that's so important to me. That dictates the whole nature of the film, regardless of what he came back with. And Athena's section is quite powerful. She's a very powerful character. And it's all about her sort of learning to realizing the power she has and harnessing that, and sort of reclaiming the shame she's been made to feel about her body. And then the music, as we move into Tiresias, becomes a bit more rhythmic. It's about him sort of relearning the world. There's a lot of bird song as well, which, as Jane mentioned earlier, because there was kind of reference to that in the myth about him being able to hear birds. And then the translation again happened when working with the dancers. And that was one of the most exciting parts of it for me, was how they used the poems as a script, sort of, and how they took the essence of these characters from the words, as well as using the words as their music, you might notice throughout they dance to the words in a sense. So yeah, it was an incredible experience, and one I feel very lucky to have had all these very talented people sort of give their own take on the poems, and especially during a time where it seemed like working collaboratively wasn't really going to be an option.
Great, and a great overview. And then there's a question that Liz Porter was asked about to Jane, I think also Ellen, if you very quickly. Her question was just around, you know, how we've been talking about how research has developed into disability and you know, antiquity, but sort of broader as well, and how disability arts or art by disabled artists might be influencing this or could influence that. And I think it's a really nice point to end on, because that's, I guess, what this day is about bringing in disabled artists to talk about their work and see how that can kind of, you know, shine new light on the way we might explore the museum collection and exhibitions. So, I mean, you know, briefly, what do you think about the place for arts and art by disabled artists in this area?
Yeah, I think they definitely go hand in hand, and I've learned from both equally. The more I work in one area, the other area benefits, and vice versa. I think disabled artists are best placed to be making that their art. And in the past, they've probably, you know, been denied the opportunity to do so. And, you know, everyone wants a day where disabled art doesn't have to be a thing as such, doesn't have to have a separate festival or a separate day, but in the same breath, there are so many brilliant benefits, and the research that can come as a result of that is one of them.
Yes, I mean, in academic research, more and more disabled scholars are working specifically on the history of disability, and of course they bring in a completely different perspective to the material and can appreciate nuances that are not obvious to academics who do not live with disabilities. And so I think for myself, something that I am really keen to do is involve people in my research. I'm very keen on experimental archaeological reconstruction, for example, because my current research is on prostheses and assistive technology. And that is something that I am not an amputee, so I need to collaborate with people who actually use these sorts of technologies, and I need to know what they think, and I think, you know, really the more open and the more collaborative these sorts of endeavors are, the better for everybody, really.
Great, thank you both. So, yeah, unfortunately, it's time now, but I think we could go on talking for the rest of the day, really. But just to say, yeah, when we end this, there will be a feedback form that pops up. So do put your thoughts in there. There's lots of comments about how much people have enjoyed today's talk, and people want to know where they can actually access, you know, more of your writing and the poems. So I'm sure, Ellen, you've got that's something we can follow up with people on.
Yeah, I'll send to you.
We haven't had time to talk about that, but yeah, do get in touch. There's email links sent in the email that you'll get tomorrow. If people don't want to do the feedback form, if people prefer to do a phone interview, we're actually doing some more in-depth feedback with the audience agency. So if people want to get in touch and let us know how you found the event, then please do, because we really like to, you know, digital, this kind of thing is all new to us, so we want to make sure that we keep on doing it and that we kind of improve the session. So I better stop talking because it's 12 o'clock now. I'm sure everyone wants to go and have some lunch and have a break. But thank you, Jane. Thank you, Ellen. Really interesting chat. And thank you all for coming.
Thank you.